July. And you know what that means. In Canada, July 1st, it's Canada Day. July 4th in the States, it's Independence Day. And about 3 to 4 weeks from now, training camp opens across the National Football League. And that's when all the casuals are going to start paying attention to fantasy football because they'll see it on TV or they'll hear about it on the radio or whatever. They'll see it on social media. Training camps are open and there's going to be highlights everywhere. But everybody watching and listening right now, you're on top of it. You're a step ahead. And we're going to reward you for it here on Fantasy Football Today by going over our off-season ADP. Remember all these mock drafts that I've asked you guys to be a part of? Well, not Heath, not Dan. They're here, but they didn't take part in any of these mock drafts. You guys, the fans. Well, we've run a lot of mock drafts, and we've got an off-season ADP. And we're going to let you in on the 5 biggest observations that we have from these mock drafts. And we're basically giving you a cheat code before the rest of your league gets it. So with that in mind, it's good to see you again, Heath. It's good to see you again, Dan. Did you have good weekends? I know what Heath did this weekend. So, Dan, I'll start with you. Anything exciting happen this weekend for you, man?
Very good weekend for me. Played golf both days, Saturday, Sunday, which was amazing for me. Played with 2 good friends I haven't seen in like 3 months on Saturday. And then Sunday was actually a little bit of bad luck. I was playing the best round of my entire life through 14. And it started to pour rain on the course. So I sat there in the rain for 30 minutes trying to wait this thing out and eventually had to give up when the greens were like soaked wet. So other than that, amazing weekend for me. How about you guys?
You know what's funny is that's like starting a draft and loving your first 3 or 4 picks,
Yes.
and then your internet craps out and you're on auto draft the rest of the way, and you end up with 2 DSTs and 2 kickers. Nothing good. So I can relate to that. I don't golf, but I can relate to that. Heath, you were at the Scott Fishbowl draft in Fort Lauderdale. You saw 2 Scott Fishbowl drafts. Can you give us one observation from those 2 drafts, something you saw that might be of interest to everybody?
First, it was awesome, and I'm so glad that Scott Fish set up these live drafts, and I'm looking forward to doing my live draft in Kansas City next week. But like, it was just such a great reminder that, yes, while Josh ADHD is going to do a great job of building his Scott Fishbowl ADP app and telling us where people have gone in different drafts, that means almost nothing. Like each individual draft with the way that Scott has set up the scoring is going to be so different. Guys like Trey McBride had a really wide range of where they were drafted. Go get your guys. Don't worry about trying to wait around so you don't take somebody too early. Go get your guys.
All right. Very good. If you want to know more about Josh ADHD's ADP, or if you want to see Heath in Kansas City, just reach out to Heath on social media. On X, he's at Heath Cummings SSR. Cummings, the S, and then SR. Heath Cummings Sr. You get what I'm saying.
It's on the screen if you wanted to watch it on YouTube.
Yeah. Which you should be, by the way. And if you are, thank you. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you're listening to us on a podcast, you can always see us live on YouTube. When we're going, and you can be notified of it by liking and subscribing it. Okay, the first observation I turned into a game. That this is my attempt to be like Azer as the host. I created a game, and the game is called ADP Says. And so I'm going to give you a scenario. I'm going to give you 2 or 3 players. Heath, Dan, you're each going to tell me who you would take first in a draft, and then I will tell you what the ADP says. So here we go with the very first one. And this is one that we've talked about a bunch so far. Who have you got first in ADP? Who would you take first, rather? Garrett Wilson or Puka Nacua? Dan Schneier.
I would take Garrett Wilson.
Heath?
Dan.
How do you know about that, Heath?
I have these 2 guys back to back, but I would take Garrett Wilson as well.
I've got them both back to back, and I have Garrett Wilson. ADP says Garrett Wilson over Puka Nacua. I don't think we need to talk about that very much. I think that there's definitely target volume, or at least expected target volume, that's going to be in Wilson's favor. Wilson's the number 1 in New York. Puka is going to be like the co-number 1 in LA. Probably should have more targets per game than Cooper Kupp, and he's healthier theoretically than Cooper Kupp. So I don't think there's much of an argument here. Does anybody have anything to add? Garrett Wilson versus Puka?
No, I think like these guys are both really risky. Like when you're talking about first round wide receivers, I'd like a little bit more safety, but like we're just counting on 40-something-year-old Aaron Rodgers coming off of an Achilles being this enormous upgrade, and Garrett Wilson doing something he's really never done in his NFL career. And then we're counting on Puka being the clear number one wide receiver over Cooper Kupp when it wasn't really that way when they were both healthy last year.
Is it enough to make you consider a running back over either or both of those guys, Heath?
I would take like 5 running backs over both of those guys.
Name them.
Christian McCaffrey, Breece Hall, Bijan Robinson, Jonathan Taylor, Jahmyr Gibbs.
I'm with you on the first 3. Dan, Jonathan Taylor, Jahmyr Gibbs. Where do they rank for you compared to Garrett Wilson and Puka Nacua?
So just the style of drafting, I mostly play in half PPR leagues, which is obviously impacting this. I also don't typically like to go running back round 1 or even round 2 a lot of the times. So I would have those two. I would have Garrett Wilson for sure over those backs. Puka scares me. I think I'm with you guys. I don't think if you really look into it, Cooper Kupp was just not healthy last year, and I don't think that should be discount. I think that is not being counted enough in his price tag this year, assuming, yes, he's older, but he could easily get back and have a healthy season with a good offseason, which I think he can and would still be I think he'd still be the number 1 target. So that scares me. But Jahmyr Gibbs I talked about this with Adam last week on the show. He scares me. So I think he's one of the scariest first-round picks in fantasy because we rarely ever see a player who is almost a guarantee to not get a workhorse role drafted in round 1. I mean, David Montgomery is not going away. David Montgomery will get 40, maybe 50% of the snaps, like possibly 60 if the game script is in his favor that week. Red zone, Gibbs will work in. He obviously worked in last year. Is he going to take all the red zone touches? Doubtful. David Montgomery is going to play a role there. So I just don't know how many times we see a running back drafted in round 1 that's in this type of timeshare situation. We don't see it with McCaffrey, Bijan, Jonathan Taylor, all the other guys you mentioned already in that mix. So he's the one who scares me the most of those guys.
I have basically boiled it down to kind of what you're looking for, because these are late round 1 picks. Maybe one of these guys falls into early round 2. And instead of necessarily focusing on the players, I focus on the position and the strategy around it. I know that drop off at wide receiver from like wide receiver 8 to wide receiver 9, and then from wide receiver 9 all the way down to wide receiver 10. And it's only one number, but it feels like a huge drop off from wide receiver 9 to wide receiver 10. I want to get one of those wide receivers if they're there. And I feel like there's going to be a lot of running backs, a lot being defined as like 5 that could be on the board when I'm picking late in round 1. And I can come back and get one of those running backs. It might not be Jahmyr Gibbs. It might not be Jonathan Taylor, but it could be Saquon Barkley, could be Kyron Williams, could be Travis Etienne. And that way I can just start my draft balance, and I've got one of those first 8 wide receivers. Wilson and Nacua figure to be wide receiver 7 and 8 off the board. And just to throw another log on the Puka Nacua is scary fire, he averaged 15.7 PPR points per game from week 5 through week 17. That was with Kupp, but he did perk that number up quite a bit. He was at 20.7 PPR points per game on 9 targets per game. In weeks 15 through 17, Kupp was on the field. Nacua stepped up. We know what Nacua did in the playoff game against Detroit. That was a huge game for him. So I'm encouraged by that late season surge from Nacua with Kupp on the field. And I think he can beat 15.7 PPR points per game. I'm okay taking him with a late round pick. I have it ranked full PPR. Wilson, Gibbs, Wilson, Nacua, Taylor, nobody named Watson is a first round pick for me. All right, next up on the ADP. Who is wide receiver 9? Dan, who's your wide receiver 9?
This is a game where we're guessing wide receiver 9. I'm thinking it's going to be, I'm guessing what the ADP says, correct?
Yeah, let's change it to what you think the ADP says, not
what I think the ADP says.
Right.
I think the ADP says Marvin Harrison Jr. is wide receiver 9.
Heath, you agree with that, or you got a different name?
That's the name.
That's the name. You guys are right on that one. I don't have a noise to, ding, there it is.
Year 1, top 10, ADP.
Wide receiver 9. Yeah, I mean, he's kind of been there for us all offseason long, so it's not a surprise. See the offseason ADP there. Does anybody have a problem with that? Does anybody not have Marvin Harrison as wide receiver 9?
I don't know if I have a problem with it. I just think I don't know if I'm the one making that pick. I don't know if I'm going to be the one taking that gamble. I don't have a problem with it, though. I see the upside. I see the case for it.
Sure.
And I'm not even so sure there's even receivers after him who I love or like feel so confident are guaranteed to be a more safe play than Harrison. So I guess the more I talk myself into it, I am okay with it.
I mean,
that's the thing is
oh, I'm sorry. Heath, please go.
If you don't want to draft running backs in round 2 and the first 8 wide receivers are gone, like what are you gonna do? You could draft Mike Evans or Michael.
I draft
Pittman
Travis Kelce a lot in that range. Honestly, I know it's considered early, but not for me.
Yeah.
Definitely early. We'll touch on that in a little bit. Harrison, I've got ranked 17th. I've got him behind Saquon, Kyron Williams, Travis Etienne. For now, I have him ahead of Pacheco. I have him ahead of Derrick Henry. And then obviously every other wide receiver that's out there that's not top 8, I've got him in there. And it's just based on projection and the fact that Kyler Murray has over-targeted his top guy pretty consistently over the course of his career. And so I want to try and get a piece of that. Dan and Heath, you know this too. The guy was an amazing talent at Ohio State. 2 years leading the Buckeyes with unbelievable numbers from 2 very different quarterbacks. And that just stands out to me as somebody who's got this awesome pedigree, raised by a Hall of Famer, et cetera, et cetera. I think he's worthy of being wide receiver 9, but it is partially because there isn't another obvious wide receiver. And I'll get into that right now with our next game of ADP Says. Who you got here? This is ADP Says. Olave versus London versus Davante Adams. And yes, I have an answer that I believe in now. After last week, I kind of fumbled it and didn't have one. Heath, you can go first. What does ADP say? Who's higher, Olave, London, or Adams?
It's got okay, so I think this is wrong because he's not one of my top 20 wide receivers, but I think it's probably Drake London.
Okay.
I think the ADP says Adams based on the drafts we've done. But again, it wouldn't be my pick of the 3, but that was what I think the AP says.
I will reveal the answer, and then you guys can each tell me who you would take of these 3. ADP says Drake London over Davante Adams, both of them ahead of Chris Olave. All right, who's your favorite of the 3?
I rank it Olave, Adams, London.
I'd probably go Olave, London, Adams, but I'm close on the second two. Heath, what are the reason you're down on? I'm sure it's projection based as well, but what is the reason you're a little bit more down on London?
I don't think I'm down on Drake London. I'm projecting him to have by far the best season of his career. Everybody else is just crazy. Like what is Drake London's best finish? Wide receiver 40 something?
Yeah.
Prior to this year, yeah.
And I understand like we're doing this. It's the same thing I said about Garrett Wilson. I've got a little bit more faith in Garrett Wilson because he's done a little bit more than Drake London has so far in his career. London has Kyle Pitts and Bijan Robinson there with him. Wilson just has Breece Hall.
It's a good point. I mean, I think that there could be others that could step in and take a little bit away from Garrett Wilson, but
those guys aren't going to be as impactful as Darnell Mooney, I don't think.
We're projecting with all these receivers, with Garrett Wilson, with Marvin Harrison, and with Drake London. I'm projecting with Chris Olave as well. I like Olave the best of these 3 because I love the target volume that he had overall last year. He averaged over 8 targets per game. His numbers, his efficiency stepped up when there was no Michael Thomas on the field. Hat tip to Rich Rebar on that one. And I think that this offense, if we're going to talk about the offense being a change in offense, being a good thing in Atlanta with Zach Robinson there, then we got to talk about it being a good thing with Clint Kubiak, who actually does have play calling experience, by the way, in New Orleans. I know Derek Carr, it's gross to think about Derek Carr as the quarterback tied to potentially your number 1 wide receiver, but it worked out to a degree last year. Olave did take a step forward last year. I say he takes another step forward again. I think he could be potentially, this is the upside case, a souped up version of Brandon Ayuk, more targets, and certainly someone who can make big splash plays just like Brandon Ayuk did. But it's interesting how Olave is last on the list among the mock drafters, and Drake London is at the top of the list. There's been a lot of positive hype around Drake London. We're going to pick up ADP Says right after a break, but before the break, I want to tell you guys, I don't know if you've heard this or not. We are a nominee for the Best Sports Podcast category in the People's Choice Podcast Awards. We talk about this every year. We're a nominee all the time, and it's a big deal to us. We appreciate you guys, everything that you do for us, the fact that you listen, the fact that you watch. We hope you enjoy our show enough to nominate us to advance to the final round. So how do you do that? How do you nominate us? You have to go to podcastawards.com, podcastawards.com/app/signup. Kind of a pain in the butt, but podcastawards.com/app/signup. And then toggle down to the sports category. Now, it probably took me longer to explain all that than it did for you to go and nominate us. But if you go and do that, just do us a solid. It won't take you more than a minute. It'll be awesome. You'll help us, and we've tried to help you. Thank you for it. We've actually included a link at the top of the episode description as well, so you can do that. More ADP Says when we come back.
Have you heard of semaglutides? Ozempic, Mounjaro?
Hartman, this could be dangerous. Let's do it.
South Park, The End of Obesity. New exclusive event, now streaming. Exclusively on Paramount Plus.
I'm going to skip around on the wide receiver ADP Says. So here's the next one. Here are 3 more names. Michael Pittman, Jaylen Waddle, Cooper Kupp. Everybody listening at home, go ahead and pick who you think the ADP Says is the highest of the 3. Dan, I'm going to put it on you first. Who does ADP say is going the highest? Michael Pittman, Jaylen Waddle, or Cooper Kupp?
ADP says Michael Pittman, I would say.
Okay.
ADP says Michael Pittman, and I agree, Michael Pittman. And I would take Michael Pittman over the 3 guys we talked about in the last segment.
Wow. Oh, wow. So Pittman over Olave, London, Davante. I mean, we're going to have a Pittman discussion at some point, but probably not on this show. Hold on to your pants, boys. Cooper Kupp is at the top of the list from our ADP. It goes Kupp, Waddle, Pittman. And these are full PPR mock drafts. I know you guys disagree. I don't even know if I can make the case for Cooper Kupp over.
I didn't say
Waddle
I disagree.
But it's interesting to me. So maybe like real quick, both of you, why might people be cold on Michael Pittman?
I'm personally cold on Michael Pittman versus consensus, but I'm going to let Heath go after because I know he's higher. So we'll have a nice little So for me, I look at the
nice conversation,
a nice little contrast there. Yeah. I look at the
that's what you
targets.
Yes,
I look at the targets per game last year when Anthony Richardson was in the game and Michael Pittman was barely ahead of Josh Downs. And I look at what happened when Anthony Richardson got injured. Gardner Minshew took over and Michael Pittman became a target hog, which I think could say some good things about Davante Adams that we're not thinking about moving forward for this year. But for this year, for the Colts, I'm a little concerned that Anthony Richardson is going to be, that Michael Pittman is going to be Anthony Richardson's guy because he certainly wasn't in that short sample. It's a very small sample size for Richardson. Things will change. But I think when you look and you dig deeper into the numbers, you see the low touchdown totals for Michael Pittman, the lack of explosive plays. A lot of his production came from target volume last year. And I'm not sure that target volume will be there this year with a quarterback change.
Yeah, I mean, it was a higher target share percentage for Michael Pittman when Gardner Minshew was the quarterback, but it was still a 26% target share for Michael Pittman when Anthony Richardson was the quarterback. And there wasn't really a super run heavy approach. My big concern for Pittman last year was that when Richardson was the quarterback, he was going to run the ball 10 times per game. Jonathan Taylor would run it 20 times per game, and they just wouldn't throw that much. And that wasn't really the case when Richardson was on the field. Their pass rate was very similar. In fact, I think a little bit lower with Minshew than it was with Richardson. I think there's a chance that this pass offense is actually more efficient this year than it was last year. And the volume doesn't really change that much. Pittman was nearly a 10 target per game type guy last year. I don't think, listen, when we're talking about the Cooper Kupp side of things, I don't think it's hard to make an argument for him at all. When he's been right, he's been one of the greatest wide receivers in the history of the NFL.
Stealing over 20 PPR points per game.
Right. And he was still seeing a lot of targets last year. So if you want to bet on a bounce back at his age, that makes sense. But I just think we're still looking at 9 targets per game for Michael Pittman, and we might see an increase in efficiency. And I don't ever want to bet on a guy just never, like we had this discussion with DJ Moore for several years, just never being able to score any touchdowns.
The touchdowns could, it's not the, I agree with you on that. I'm not necessarily looking at it like the touchdown, since he hasn't scored, he's not going to be able to, because like we know, touchdown regression is the best way for us to see the variance in fantasy sports, because he could easily pop for 7 or 8. But I would push back on one thing, Heath, the numbers that you brought up with the rushing with Minshew versus Richardson and the rush rates of the Colts. To be fair, that was before Jonathan Taylor was on the field for the Colts. So it was a little bit of a different offense in my mind, at least, when Richardson's playing without Taylor out there and when Minshew's playing with Taylor out there. I figure they would be a little more run heavy. And that, again, will factor in a little bit for me this year with Taylor fully healthy, ready to go. Will that alter their approach in any way? That's just something I'm concerning myself with. I know what you're saying, and then there's so much upside for a player like Anthony Richardson, the way he can throw a football. And it's not just like the arm talent and the way you watch him throw bombs. Like you watch some of the windows he fit into last year and some of the processing, and it's like this could be the best passing game. And in that case, Pittman, or one of the best passing games. In that case, Pittman will be a great pick. It's just a little bit too uncertain for me right now.
He was averaging, this is Pittman. Pittman was averaging 8 targets per game with Richardson. That's the 2 full games with Richardson. 14.1 PPR points per game. If we're going to say that Pittman had a great year last year, whatever the efficiency was with Gardner Minshew, certainly the target share was higher with Minshew than it was in the small sample size with Richardson. He was still at 15.6 PPR per game. And there are a few receivers in this league that are big, physical, but they aren't necessarily explosive. And they're forced into being volume dependent. And I think in the case of Pittman, he is going to be volume. He's going to get that volume. But I think it's going to be in the 8 target per game range, not 9 or not 10. And because he's not as explosive as other wide receivers that are going to get drafted around him, I think he's going to be right in the same range when we talk PPR points, about 15, maybe 16 PPR.
Which 15.5 is where Jaylen Waddle was 2 years ago. And 15.5 is where Jaylen Waddle was last year in the games that he didn't leave early because of injury. So I don't think you're necessarily wrong. I just don't think in this range that 15.5 is a put down.
I have Pittman just ahead of I have both of them ahead of Waddle. I'm kind of nervous about Jaylen Waddle. All right, I am going to skip the rest of the wide receiver. ADP says, let's go to quarterbacks. And I only have one quarterback question. Who does ADP say is QB1? Open-ended question. You can answer anybody you want. But, I mean, there's only
Josh Allen.
names. Josh Allen, Heath says. What do you say, Dan?
I think it's going to be a bit surprising. I think ADP says Patrick Mahomes.
ADP says Jalen Hurts is QB1.
Wow.
Back-to-back with Josh Allen, which tells me that the general public will not have a consensus on who QB1 is going to be. And it's very interesting to me because I think we all have, with Jamie, Patrick Mahomes is our QB1 and not Hurts and not Allen. I find that fascinating. I think it's going to make it interesting to draft quarterbacks, and certainly we'll talk about this later with other ADP observations, but there is no consensus QB1 and no one's taking quarterbacks with a top 20 pick. And so maybe they're smartening up a little bit, Heath.
I think we will see a quarterback with the top 20 pick by the time we get to August. But Hurts is my QB2. So that to me is more understandable than Josh Allen is, just because I don't worry about Hurts rushing touchdowns regressing as much as I worry about Allen's rushing touchdowns regressing. Hurts has been a double-digit touchdown rusher basically whenever he's been a starter. Allen has been a 7 to 8 per season guy until last year. I do think that we might just be like, look at what happened to Patrick Mahomes last year. They go win the Super Bowl. Sure, they don't need any wide receivers, but he needs wide receivers for fantasy production. Does Josh Allen? I think he probably does. And I think Kellen Moore is going to be much better as an offensive coordinator for Jalen Hurts than the mess that they were dealing with last year.
Right.
Yeah. I would agree. I'm worried about Saquon Barkley taking more work away than we might even initially believe. But I still think Jalen Hurts gets minimum 9 rushing touchdowns, which is
Dan,
close to his floor.
Saquon Barkley let's assume it's not peak Saquon Barkley, but he doesn't lose a step from the last couple of years. So it's still the Saquon Barkley.
He's not the guy that he was when he was a rookie.
That guy is not, to me, the type of back that I worry about stealing all the goal line carries from Jalen Hurts when he's been so successful at that. Saquon Barkley at his best has never been you need to get 1 yard. That's your guy. He's the guy who's going to go get you 80, right?
Right. But he's also going to be the guy that could take designed carries away from Jalen Hurts. That's where I think the biggest impact is.
It's a question of, will the Eagles start to, with this huge contract with Hurts, start to worry about, should we stop running him right up the middle into contact without Jason Kelce there? every single time we're in the red zone? I don't know the answer to that.
No,
And I
I think
think
the
it's-
answer to that is yes when it's at the goal line, no in other situations. And I
Right.
don't know if that, like, even when they're at the 50, I don't think they're going to call as many design runs for Hurts when they've got Saquon Barkley there, who they can use in a number of ways.
I just don't, and it's so hard to judge because he's been stuck in New York. But Saquon Barkley's the way he's elevated teams has not been because of his rushing efficiency the last few years. It's not been because like what you want to do is build an offense around handing the ball off to him. It's he makes big plays and he's good in the passing game.
I've got one more round of ADP says, and then we'll get into the rest of the observations. And it's at running back. Who you got between James Cook, Isiah Pacheco, Josh Jacobs? Who does ADP take first? What is it? Who's first on the off-season Ask FFT fan mock draft ADP?
I think it's Pacheco is the answer to this. This is an interesting range, guys. I mean, look, this is like round 2, 3 turn. This is what you're getting at the end of round 2.
Yes.
I don't know how comfortable I feel with any of those guys you just mentioned.
If I wasn't such a coward, I'd have James Cook close to round 1. He would easily be my pick from this group. And I think he's going to challenge to be a top 3 or 4 running back this year if everything goes right.
Wow.
But I'm going to guess Jacobs is the answer from ADP.
ADP says
Pacheco.
Dan's right. Isiah Pacheco, then James Cook, then Josh Jacobs. And they're all pretty close to each other, and they're all in that range. Heath, can you make the case for James Cook?
Yeah, he was basically a 20 to 21 touch per game guy. Once they changed offensive coordinators last year, that continued into the playoffs. It was 16 plus carries, 4 or 5 targets almost every single week. And that's the offense. That's one of the reasons I have Josh Allen not ranked as a top 2 quarterback, because I do think this offense is going to continue to see a whole lot of James Cook. And I don't believe, again, it's kind of the Michael Pittman thing. I don't believe he's just going to score 2 rushing touchdowns every season. He scored 2 on like 75 carries as a rookie, and then 2 on 220 carries in his second season. I wouldn't be surprised if he scores 4 more touchdowns and averages more. He's an actual true workhorse running back, 20 touches per game. And other than McCaffrey, Hall, and Bijan, there's nobody I'm certain is going to be better than James Cook this year.
So I'm nervous that was just that workload was because they didn't really like anybody else that they had. Because you think about the other running backs that they had Latavius, and he got numbers. He had some work each week, and Ty Johnson, and I think Leonard Fournette was there. He barely played. I wonder if they just felt like they had no choice. And not that they've got huge options now. They drafted Ray Davis, and Ty Johnson is still there. I get a little nervous thinking about these Bills running backs. I think about the track record of them alongside Josh Allen and how they always seem to disappoint. I can't disagree about 2 things you said. Number one, just the touchdowns. He's obviously going to get more than 2. I mean, don't be ridiculous. But also, he's really talented. He's a good running back. I worry a little bit about how much work he'll really get. I worry about how he finished last year. His last 5 games, including the playoffs, he was really in Dudsville. Did not put up many good numbers at all. I've got Pacheco ranked ahead of him, and I'm a Jacobs fan, so I've got Jacobs ranked ahead of Cook too. But it just worries me a little bit, especially when you start talking about James Cook as a potential round 1 pick. That means some people might start reaching for James Cook after some other running backs go. And that's fine. If you believe in James Cook, you got to do what you got to do. Dan, real quick, 15 seconds on Isiah Pacheco.
Pacheco, we love to see at the end of the season, he started to get more involved in the passing game. Red zone, I think, is where the key is going to be, though, because I don't think we'll ever see a season like we saw last year with how low passing touchdown total from Patrick Mahomes, especially if Kelsey is healthier, and if those rookie receivers can get going. So I think the touchdowns might come down, but that's more projection, and we're going on touchdown regression and luck. So you said 15 seconds, so I am excited about the passing game role. I'm a little nervous about the touchdowns red zone role.
I think the touchdown red zone role could go up if he stays healthy and is in that role for 17 games. I feel safer with Pacheco over a 17-game season, typical PPR league, than I do James Cook. It's close, but I think Pacheco's a little bit better. All right. I've got 4 more observations from our offseason mock drafts with the fans. Here's one of them. the first 2 rounds are basically half running backs and half wide receivers, which means most drafters will begin RB, wide receiver, or wide receiver, or RB. So they're going to go for that balanced approach. And we've seen that in a lot of the drafts that we've done too. I want to ask you guys, do you have a preference on how you want to start, or are you open to just if there's a running back you love, you're going to target a wide receiver in round 2. If there's a wide receiver that you love and you take in round 1, you take a running back in round 2. How do you kind of split that or think about that, Heath, when you're up in round 1? Do you have that type of idea in your head when you go to draft?
I don't at all. I have no real intentional positional strategy when it comes to running backs and wide receivers in the early
Seriously,
rounds.
no intentional positional strategy?
That's correct. Seriously. The only thing out of all the different combinations, running back, wide receiver, running back, wide receiver, running back is the only one that I'm like, oh, I don't want to do this. And so like the only way I'm probably going to do that is if I have McCaffrey or Hall or Robinson in round 1, and then I get to the end of round 2 and James Cook's still there. Otherwise, if I take a running back in round 1, I'm probably taking a wide receiver in round 2. If I take a wide receiver in round 1, anything is possible.
And if you're taking James Cook in late round 2, you're probably looking at, let's name some receivers that we've talked about already: Drake London, Chris Olave,
Sure.
Davante Adams. You can go back for whoever's left from that group of receiver.
For me,
Maybe
it would be
somebody
Evans
else
or
they don't
Pittman.
Yeah,
For me,
or
it'd be
Pittman.
Evans or Pittman. Yeah.
If you really love Pittman, fine. But that probably eases the pain of starting RB if you're in the early round. So I don't necessarily hate that if I've got an early round pick because I can go and collect that wide receiver third. Plus, like, Harrison's going to be gone. Garrett Wilson's going to be gone. Puka's going to be gone. Like, it's the same class of wide receiver anyway. So I don't hate running back there. Where I might hate running back is if I'm picking late in round 1 and I've got Jahmyr Gibbs in round 1 and I take Saquon in round 2, because now the wide receivers that are left in late round 3 probably aren't going to be as pretty as the ones that are going to be there in early round 3. Certainly not as good as early round 2. Dan, are you on board with that? Is that kind of a death knell on your team to start RB if you've got a late round 1 pick?
It's not a death knell. It's something that I don't like to do for a multitude of reasons. The first and most important for me is the anti-fragility argument. I've made this case on Beyond the Box Score plenty of times. We actually had to explain it to Adam, who never heard of this argument. But the argument essentially is, you're betting on the guys who are less likely to get injured with your early round pick. So running back, a position that typically has the most injuries. So if I'm going running back rounds 1 and 2 with my 2 biggest assets, I'm building a little more of a fragile build, and I'm putting a lot more risk into my build. So it's not something I like to do, but it's not something I turn my mind off to. Like, if I have one of those late picks and it's like Jonathan Taylor and I mean, the only problem is I do see a tier break off after Hall, Bijan, and McCaffrey.
Yeah, sure.
So it's like, if I feel like I'm still kind of losing out, even if I go, AA and I go Jonathan Taylor and another running back I like quote unquote there. So it's an interesting scenario. You know what I find myself doing a lot in round 2, especially when I'm picking in the early half of round 1, but even sometimes in the middle half of round 1, is just going Travis Kelce in round 2. And I'm not really sure what the argument against Travis Kelce is, other than that he's 1 year older than he was last year when we were drafting him in round 1, and 2 years older than he was 2 years ago when we were drafting him at like 6th overall, and he was worth that and winning us week after week. He was injured last year. He played 200 fewer snaps than he's played in any season. He had 3 fewer targets per game than he's had in any season due to the injury. His touchdowns went from like 12, 9, 9, 10 over the last 4 years to just 5 last year. Yeah. And I guess we can say this is going to happen again, or we could say that he was just playing hurt last year. He's only 1 year older than he was. He looked very effective in the playoffs, and now he has Xavier Worthy and Marquise Brown opening up space in the middle of the field by running clear out routes and actually drawing attention of safeties, because he's not Marquez Valdes-Scantling, who nobody gives a crap about running in the open field.
Sure.
So that's kind of where I'm at with Kelce, and I don't really understand his ADP. So for me, I'm just happy to take him.
Okay, I can do the anti-Kelce thing.
Yeah, give me the anti-Kelce. You're the Chiefs guy.
Go ahead.
I'm happy to do
a lot.
He's going to be 35 years old.
So he's 34.
35. He was 34 last year, and he wasn't worth a second round pick
because he got hurt.
Well, you know why he got hurt? He's 35 years old. Yeah. Like, I think that's easy. It's not. it's fine to take him in round 2 and say you're expecting a bounce back. It doesn't make any sense to say you don't understand the case against a 35-year-old guy when you're explaining away last year because he got hurt.
Then me and you have a different opinion of what injuries are based on. I think they're mostly luck based. I think he fell awkwardly on his knee and got hurt. You think it was because he was 34.
You're a younger guy, Dan. You've not gone through this process like Dave and I have.
At 33 or 34, you're less likely to get injured.
Well, he did get hurt at 34,
but he didn't at 33.
What happens is as you get older, your body is more likely to break down and it takes longer to recover. Maybe more importantly, the Chiefs are at this stage now where why would you risk playing Travis Kelce too much in September or October or November when it's pretty clear that you're going to be in the AFC Championship game?
That's the argument I like. That's what scares me about Kelce. That are they going to arrest him and not? And actually, is this going to be the new norm? He plays 200 fewer snaps, and it wasn't just because he was hurt. I don't think the touchdowns have any chance of staying as low as 5, though. I will say that for sure.
I don't know about that, but I will also say that he was at 10.6 yards per reception last year, which was by far a career low. His 65 yards per game was his lowest mark since 2015. There was, and maybe it was just because he was playing hurt.
Yeah.
But there was.
But what happened in the playoffs? He kind of looked like himself in the playoffs, did he not?
Well, that's because he rested in the regular season.
Okay, that's fair.
Do you really think if they are going to take snaps off of him, do you really think those snaps are going to be, inside the 30, third down? Key.
They're not going to have as many snaps inside the 30 now.
In that guy for Patrick Mahomes.
Why not?
They're going to be scoring from the 40 and the 50 again. They've got Hollywood Brown and Xavier Worthy.
Right. So I buy that argument. The fact that Marquise Brown and Xavier Worthy can take some targets and some numbers off of Travis Kelce. I buy that, but I don't buy that the snaps that he will lose will be valuable snaps. I still think he's going to play a lot in the red zone, goal to go, third downs, all those situations. Here's the other thing. What was the number one reason why people were taking Travis Kelce in round 1 a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago?
To me, it was the positional advantage.
Thank you. It was a huge advantage that you could only really get with Travis Kelce. To a degree, you could get it with Mark Andrews and with George Kittle, certainly compared to the streaming tight ends, of course. But now I feel like there are so many other tight ends that can come in and play and come close to where Kelce could be this year relative to where he was last year, that it takes away that advantage. And to me, Dan, I think you're taking him a little too high. The problem is that if you're picking late in round 1, that means you're picking late in round 3. Kelce probably won't make it back to you. So if you really want to have him, you got to take him in round 2. And here's the last point, and then we're going to take a break, and then we're going to move on with more observations. Here are the wide receivers. Let's say that you can't believe it. Your first round pick is Jahmyr Gibbs and your second round pick is Jonathan Taylor. Okay. 2 stud running backs. Really hard to pass that up in full PPR. Here are the receivers in our ADP that'll be waiting for you in late round 3. DJ Moore, Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, Cooper Kupp, Jaylen Waddle, DK Metcalf. If those names make you squirm as being your wide receiver 1, you probably should take a wide receiver early on, even if you have this opportunity to get 2 stud running backs. Okay, one more break. We'll be back with more observations.
Well, you need your sports news anywhere?
We've got breaking news to bring you.
Then get your sports anytime you want them. Big trade news overnight to discuss.
Because we know you need sports all the time.
A lot of movement in the rankings this week.
A legend adds to their legacy.
We're bringing you that breaking news right here on HQ.
CBS Sports HQ, anywhere, anytime, all the time.
We've talked a lot about wide receivers going in round 3. I just ran down 6 names for you, but they really start to dominate. That position dominates not just round 3, but rounds 3, 4, and 5. In our ADP, 19 wide receivers go in that range of rounds 3 through 5. That's compared to 8 running backs, 5 tight ends, 7 quarterbacks. 7 quarterbacks taken by the end of round 5 in our ADP. Here's my first question. The fact that there's 19 wide receivers with an ADP between rounds 3 and 5, does this group take the pressure off of taking a wide receiver early, or maybe more specifically 2 wide receivers early? And I'm not going to run through 19 names. That's just monotonous. But knowing that there's just this big glut of wide receivers, that can probably get you anywhere between 13 and 15 PPR points per game, some of them higher than that. Dan, does that make you feel a little bit better about waiting on wide receiver if you wanted to?
No, because I think the reason we're seeing this glut of wide receivers in this range is mostly market determined. And it doesn't mean necessarily that I'm confident in these receivers. I would suggest that it's hard for me to feel confident that we're even going to get 13 to 15 points per game out of these guys. Some will, and then some will just be not worth anything, which we see every year from this range of wide receivers and running backs that we draft. That's just kind of how fantasy football is. It falls off fast. But with that said, I'm also personally, as I draft, and you saw this in the last draft we did. Well, I don't remember what our last mock was, but it was a PPR mock. And I went 4 wide receivers with my first 4 picks, filling out my flex before I filled out RB1, RB2, or QB1, or tight end 1, because I'm a big believer in winning the flex. I'm a big believer in your flex counts just as much as your running back 1 or your QB1 or your tight end 1 on a weekly basis. A lot of people feel like, I don't need to fill the flex. I'll just fill up my lineup and then go to the flex. I look at it very differently. I want to have a big edge on the flex. So if I can for me, like even if I draft 2 receivers in this range, Dave, I'm happy to go wide receiver round 1, wide receiver round 2, and then 2 receivers with 2 of these next 3 picks, and then maybe a running back or a tight end or a quarterback.
Do you remember the names that you drafted? Can you go through your first 6 picks? If you need a minute, I can give you a minute to go.
Give me a minute. I'll go find the draft.
So I think, there's a big difference in my projections between Marvin Harrison and most of the names you just said.
Okay.
Like a full point per game difference between Harrison and my wide receiver 18. But there's very little difference for me between Olave and Davante Adams and Drake London and that entire group. Like there's this massive tier. So I don't feel like I have to take a wide receiver in round 3 because a lot of the round 4 and round 5 guys are basically kind of the same guy. But you shouldn't. It works the same way at running back. Like you're going to get 2 really good players in the first 2 rounds, hopefully. If I'm at the end of round 2, I'm not quite as sure about that. Even a wide receiver.
Sure. I think it makes sense for fantasy drafters to grab a rank list. It could be whoever you choose, and cross off names that you don't like from wide receiver 1 all the way down to wide receiver 30. And the more names you cross off, the more you should prioritize wide receiver. The fewer names you cross off, the more you should go after other positions. Dan, you got your team?
No, I'm struggling here to find it.
Also, like Dan's
but
approach.
I understand what you're saying, Dan, about getting the flex and trying to lock that up and trying to have that advantage there. My philosophy with flex is I'm always trying to get great players. I like having the, pun intended, flexibility to start whatever I can, the best available player on my bench after I set all the other spots. I don't want to necessarily like wedge in one guy into the flex because if things go wrong, you got to take them out. You need to have somebody else there. Heath, go ahead.
My one. Oh, sorry.
Heath, you there?
You got it, Dan.
No, that was on me. I have one quick point, then we'll throw it to you.
Go ahead. I don't care who talks. Somebody talks.
Just to wrap that point up, my thinking on it, I just want to give my explanation on it. My thinking on it is that if you look at the data is pretty clear that in PPR leagues, you are losing if you're filling your flex with anything but a wide receiver over time. You are not playing a winning strategy. That needs to be a wide receiver. So for me, that's what, like we talked about going into drafts. Like, do you care about going wide receiver round 1? Are you locked into positional strategy? No, but I am locked in. The one thing I think about in every PPR draft is I want to make sure my flex is a receiver.
So that's definitely true if you're comparing wide receiver 30 to running back 30. I think it's definitely true probably in full PPR if you're comparing wide receiver 24 to running back 24. But if we get into a situation, this is where, because like Ben Gretsch was talking about that 2 or 3 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, like he was not going even a step further. He wanted to draft as many wide receivers as he could start plus 1 more just to make sure that he had all those.
And I do that as well.
Right. That works much better when the balance of running backs and wide receivers is even in the first 5 rounds.
Sure.
If we have a situation like we see in best ball ADP, and I don't know how much this is going to transfer over to redraft ADP when we get to August, but right now you look at best ball ADP and you could find RB12 maybe in round 6.
Mm-hmm.
Correct.
If I'm all of a sudden comparing wide receiver 36 to RB12, then flexing a running back sounds pretty damn good.
Yes.
Yeah, you make a great point, Heath, especially when you're talking about just like the market and how it dictates it. And you gain, like, you don't want to Okay, you don't want to always be zigging when everyone else is zigging. You do want to throw zag in because, like it said, Heath, you can lead to that where you have the upside of an RB12 there. Where vice versa, if you're taking a receiver in that range, you don't really have wide receiver 12 upside with that type of receiver. Is the point you're trying to make, correct?
Right. It's just it really is determined by how the draft goes, and that's why I talk like the no intentional positional strategy joke is real, because you don't know. We're going to have some drafts on CBS, Dave, this year that go. There's a quarterback in round 1. Travis Kelce's going early in round 2. We got a bunch of running backs, and Dan's approach is going to crush leagues like that.
Yes.
Because you can get 4 of your top 20 wide receivers or something, and it works out fantastic. But there's also going to be a lot of leagues that look like best ball ADP right now, because that's the thing that's been out there already for 6 months or 4 months. And you're going to have very, very good running backs available in round 6 or 7.
I don't hate Dan's strategy as long as you're not reaching for any of those wide receivers. Like if you get to the point where you're taking, I love Olave. If you're taking Chris Olave at 16 overall, just because you have to have a wide receiver and you've got the blinders on, I don't like that. I'm always going to be a proponent of drafting like the best player available, trying not to fill positional need. It's okay if you go 0 RB. Doesn't mean you have to take nothing but receivers. You can take a tight end early on if there's one that you really like. If there's a quarterback value that's there in round 3 or round 4, you can go ahead and do that. I think that that's important stuff. I want to continue with this whole idea of what happens after round 5. And this is where our next observation comes in. Once those wide receivers are gone after round 5, and remember, 19 wideouts with an ADP between rounds 3 and 5, that's when the running back run begins. And I almost think it's worth it to look at this is right around RB 13, 14 or so in the consensus rankings, all the way down. Maybe not 14. That might be a little too high. Maybe 16. I can give you some names. But our ADP says 5 running backs went in round 6, 4 in round 7, 6 in round 8. I think drafters are going to take a beeline to those running backs right after round 5. That's when they're going to look for their RB2. The 0 RB drafters, they're going to get 2 running backs back to back. One of them will be their RB1 by default. But I think that's the range when we're going to start seeing running backs go.
Yeah. I think.
Does anybody? Is there a reaction to that, or is that kind of like what you?
I thought I was going to let Heath talk. I didn't want to jump. I felt like I jumped in front of Heath earlier, and I felt bad about.
I mean, you're talking about like basically the first 2 rounds are half running back, and then there's a 3-round wide receiver run, and then maybe the next 3 rounds are close to half running back, and that makes sense. And if drafts go like that, then I think there's going to be some great running back values available at that time.
So let me give you some names. Dan, let me give you some names, and then you can react. What if you had to start these guys as your RB1? Sure. David Montgomery, Raheem Mostert, Aaron Jones. This is the order of our ADP, by the way. I'm reading it straight down the line. All right, Montgomery is just outside of a round 5 pick in our ADP. Gross. Montgomery, Raheem Mostert, Aaron Jones, James Conner. James Conner behind Aaron Jones, really? Yeah, it is. Najee Harris, Jonathan Brooks, DeAndre Swift's after that. I'm not going to read you all the names, but those are the highlights. Those are the studs.
If those are the highlights, then I'm really not excited. I would like to have 2 running backs before that, please.
Aren't those running backs that you settle for as your RB2, Dan?
It just depends. Like everybody has such a different approach to fantasy. For me, I'm not so focused on like what's my RB1 and what's my RB2. I'm focused on like how do I get as many fantasy points on a per game basis as I can get. Sure. And to me, in that sense, it's why I always end up with these very light running back rosters. Light at RB1, not always light at RB1. I will take a hero RB1 approach if I can get one of the big 3. I will do that this year. But other than that, I'm like okay getting any of these because it's going to change so much in season as far as who is actually worth an RB2. Even if you look at some of the guys you mentioned there, Heath mentioned he's not very excited about them, but some of those first few guys, obviously taking out some of the guys we don't like as much, but naming them again, like David Montgomery was a very solid RB2 for a large part of last season. Jonathan Brooks, if he gets that Rashad Wright role, will be a league winner and will be an RB2/RB1 there if he gets that role. Of course, there's more ifs with this range, but I look at it like I kind of feel like if this is the range where we have where what you're saying is true and receivers are going rounds 3 through 5, I can almost go receiver rounds 1 and 2. Take a running back or 2 in that 3 to 5 range, and then know that I can always come back and start to get, because if I'm going wide receiver 1 and 2 early, one thing I do, it's not like I'm not building out any running backs on my roster. my bench will then start to be more running back heavy. My early bench picks will be running backs I'm hoping can break out. So I'll now have 3-4. It's kind of like the 0 RB approach where you start to take more of these mid to late round running backs and you hope one will hit. So I think if it's going like you're saying and receivers are just going so heavy rounds 3 to 5, I'm okay taking some gambles here at running back.
And these are the running backs that you're taking if your first 4 picks are wide receivers.
Right? Yeah, right, correct. And I'm okay with a lot of those guys you mentioned personally, with the exception of maybe Aaron Jones.
That's 0 RB. That's what it's all about. Okay, let's move on to the last observation that we've got. Drafters love the price tag on top tier tight ends. I don't think anybody's reaching for any of the tight ends. 5 tight ends are going in the first 55 picks, 7 in the first 70 picks, none with a top 20 pick. So this kind of goes back to what I talked about with why Travis Kelce isn't in the same type of position in our minds as fantasy drafters as he has been in the past. So Heath, is the goal to take the first tight end whose value slips even a little bit, like a little bitty bit? Or are we just having a different type of idea toward how we draft tight ends this year?
Mine's pretty much whichever, and I don't agree with the big 5. I think it's a big 4, but my thought is pretty much whichever one of Kelce, McBride, Laporta, or Andrews is available in round 4 is the guy that I want to draft. And if none of them fall.
Oh, we lost Heath's sound.
We did lose.
Probably not taking a tight end until round 7.
Repeat what you said. The last 10 seconds, we lost your sound.
If none of those tight ends fall to round 4, then I'm probably not taking a tight end until round 7.
Here's the order of the ADP. It's Laporta. His ADP is 26.6. Kelce's at 27.6. I'm scrolling. I believe Mark Andrews is next. He is at 39.6.
Love it.
And then Trey McBride, 46.7.
The best value of the draft at any position.
You don't have Dalton Kincaid in you have a top 4, not a top 5. I guess it's like a tier thing.
Kincaid is not my 5th tight end either.
Okay. Who is your 5th tight end?
Kittle.
Who's going right after Kincaid. So I'll just give you both these. Kincaid is at 53.3 and George Kittle is at 63.9. Kyle Pitts is ahead of George Kittle in our ADP. Kyle Pitts is at 61.2. So those are the 7 that are being drafted in the top 70. Dan, is there 1 or 2 of those values that really stand out to you as great?
Yeah, for me, this seems to happen every year for me at tight end. I'm either taking Travis Kelce every year, or usually I have 1 or 2 guys I love in this range. Typically, though, I have 0 guys I love in this range. It's actually kind of weird, I should say, that I have guys I like in this range, because typically I'll either go Kelce, Andrews, or bust. But there are guys that I'm targeting this year in this range, and those 3 are going to be Dalton Kincaid, Kyle Pitts, and Brock Bowers. Those are the tight ends I want. If I don't get any of those 3 or Kelce, I'm punting on the position.
I don't think we've talked enough about what Bowers' upside is. That's something that we're going to have to put on our list. But I know that the minicamp reports were great. Heath, I was with you on those Scott Fishbowl drafts. He was going round 6, tight end premium leagues. It kind of surprised me that he was sliding a little.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a pretty big Gardner Minshew fan.
Yeah.
But
the literal biggest Gardner Minshew.
Davante Adams is going to get 10 targets per game. Like that's you can.
And Antonio Pierce wants to run the football.
They are going to run the ball and run the ball and run the ball. I don't understand the theory of Brock Bowers as a top 5 tight end without an injury to Davante Adams.
Well, the theory is he's
all right. Go ahead, Dan. I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry, David. I mean to cut you off. I want you to go, and then I'll do a little bit on Brock Bowers.
I don't think Brock Bowers should be drafted with the idea that he'll finish as a top 5 tight end. And I think that either the Raiders are going to have to throw a lot more than we're thinking, or something happens to Davante Adams for Bowers to get there. But I love his versatility. The fact that Georgia used him as a short yardage goal line guy in college, and he was used as a wildcat quarterback occasionally. He did that in high school. That's something that could be added in. I'm not drafting him for those reasons. I'm drafting him because he's an explosive tight end who's not a blocking tight end, and he could very easily finish second on the team in targets, and it could be triple digits. It could be 100 targets. It could be 105 targets when the season's over with. And his ADP is even, obviously it's lower than everybody that we've talked about. I almost think you can get him in late round 8, round 9. And I think that's good value, but I'm looking for value at tight end overall. And when there's one that shows up with at least a little bit of value, I'm jumping on him. And I'm not worried about trying to get massive value and to steal one away from the rest of the league. If Kelsey or Laporta is there in round 3, I'm probably going to take him. If Kincaid's there in round 5, round 6, I'm going to take him. If McBride's there round 4, round 5, I'm going to take him. But if people are reaching for tight ends in front of me, I don't mind waiting. I think that there's enough at the position where I'm not going to have a huge advantage, but I don't think I'm going to have a huge disadvantage either, Dan. I think there's enough tight ends to go around.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Those are the observations. That's what's happening in our offseason ADP. We will continue to run mock drafts with you guys all offseason long. And the offseason, listen, the offseason, we still got 3 or 4 weeks left in this offseason, and then the preseason comes around. I consider training camp part of the preseason. So I hope you guys are hyped for the fantasy action that's to come, and you guys are now a step ahead of what the general public will feel because they're not thinking about ADP right now. They're going to chomp on their hot dogs and their burgers, their barbecues over the 4th of July. They're not thinking about fantasy. Their loss, our win. We'll be back on Tuesday with more Fantasy Football Today. For Heath and Dan, I'm Dave. Thanks for coming out.